Hollow success. The champagne flute trembled slightly in Josephine Bennett's hand as she stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Malibu estate. The Pacific stretched before her, waves catching the last golden light of sunset, but the beauty felt hollow as she checked her watch for the fifth time. Marcus was 3 hours late. Again. She set down her glass, untouched, and silenced another congratulatory text from a friend who assumed they were celebrating their third anniversary together. How could she explain that her husband was halfway, across the world closing another acquisition for Horizon Technologies? When they'd met 4 years ago, Josephine had been captivated by Marcus Reeves's intensity. As a rising environmental lawyer and him a tech entrepreneur with visions of sustainable technology, they'd connected immediately over shared dreams of changing the world. Their courtship had been a whirlwind, late-night conversations about the future, spontaneous weekend trips, and a proposal beneath the northern lights that still made her heart ache with its remembered perfection. "This is just the beginning," he'd promised when they purchased this house, his arms wrapped around her waist as they stood on this very spot. "Everything I'm building is for us." But us had gradually transformed into separate lives. First came the missed dinners, then weekends at the office, and finally the international trips that stretched from days into weeks into months. Josephine's phone buzzed with a video call. She composed herself before answering. "Happy anniversary, Joe," Marcus said, his face tired but handsome even through the pixelated connection. A hotel room in Tokyo formed the backdrop. "I'm sorry I couldn't make it back." "The merger?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "We're expanding into renewable energy infrastructure across Southeast Asia. This could change everything." His eyes lit up with the familiar passion that had once been directed at her. "The board approved my proposal, unanimously." "That's wonderful," she replied, the words practiced and hollow. "Congratulations. I've sent something special for you. It should arrive tomorrow." Another designer gift that would sit in her closet, untouched. Another substitute for his presence. "When are you coming home?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her question. 2 weeks, maybe 3. There's a situation in Singapore I need to handle personally." He glanced away, distracted by something off-screen. "I should go. There's a call coming in from the legal team." After they disconnected, Josephine wandered through their sprawling home. 6 bedrooms for children they'd once talked about but never had time to conceive. A chef's kitchen, where she occasionally cooked elaborate meals for one. A media room, where she fell asleep alone watching old movies. The next morning, a courier delivered an exquisite emerald necklace. The card read, "For the most beautiful woman in my world. Until I return. Love, M." Josephine placed it in her jewelry box alongside last year's diamond bracelet and the ruby earrings from Christmas, all perfectly chosen, all rarely worn. That afternoon, she met her friend Deirdre for lunch at their favorite cafe in Santa Monica. "You can't keep living like this," Deirdre said bluntly, after Josephine explained Marcus's absence. "You had your own career, your own dreams." "I still do environmental consultations," Josephine defended weakly. "Part-time work isn't the same as the partnership track you were on. You gave that up to support his vision." Deirdre's eyes softened. "When was the last time you felt truly happy, Joe?" The question lingered as Josephine drove home along the coast. She'd become a visitor in her own life, waiting for a future that kept receding like the horizon. Something had to change, but the thought of dismantling the carefully constructed facade of their perfect marriage terrified her almost as much as continuing this elegant imprisonment. That night, she stood in Marcus's home office, surrounded by awards and photographs documenting his meteoric rise. In every image, she stood beside him, smiling proudly. But in the most recent photos, she noticed something she hadn't before. The growing distance in her eyes, the slight strain in her smile. Josephine opened her laptop and began researching environmental law firms in Los Angeles. It was time to reclaim some part of herself, whether Marcus noticed or not. The hollow success of being Mrs. Reeves had sustained her for 3 years, but it wouldn't carry her through a lifetime. Distant Shores, the West Side Women's Foundation. Headquarters buzzed with activity as Josephine guided a group of donors through their newly renovated space. 6 months had passed since she'd decided to revive her professional life, and while she hadn't returned to law practice, she'd found unexpected purpose volunteering with the organization that supported women entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. "And here's our new technology training center," she explained, gesturing to a room filled with gleaming computers. "Many of our participants have never had access to current technology. This gives them the tools to compete in today's digital marketplace." Victoria Hernandez, the foundation's director, smiled approvingly as Josephine fielded questions with confident expertise. Later, as the donors departed with promises of support, Victoria pulled her aside. "The board meeting went well," she said. "We'd like to offer you the position of outreach director. It's part-time but with potential to grow." Josephine blinked in surprise. "I wasn't expecting—" "You've done more in 6 months as a volunteer than most people accomplish in years," Victoria interrupted. "You understand these women because you've experienced what it means to put your ambitions aside. The difference is, you have resources they don't." The drive home gave Josephine time to consider the offer. Marcus had been in Singapore for nearly a month now, their communication reduced to brief texts and occasional short calls. Would he even notice if she took this position? Did it matter if he didn't? Their Malibu home felt particularly empty that evening. A thin layer of dust had settled on the piano she once played daily. Josephine wandered to their bedroom where her phone chimed with a message from Marcus. "Deal taking longer than expected. Another 2 weeks minimum. Miss you." No mention of her birthday next week. She doubted he remembered. Josephine opened her closet, pushing aside designer dresses to reach a box hidden in the back. Inside lay remnants of her former self. Her law school graduation photos, the environmental impact studies she'd worked on, newspaper clippings of cases she'd helped win. These had once defined her before she became simply Marcus Reeves's wife. The next morning, she called Victoria to accept the position. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Josephine's life that had been missing for years. Her days filled with purpose as she developed programs, met with community leaders, and mentored women starting their own businesses. For the first time in years, she returned home tired but fulfilled. Marcus's birthday gift, a rare first-edition book on environmental law that she'd once mentioned wanting, arrived with another apologetic note about his extended absence. The tender thoughtfulness of the gift made her heart ache with what might have been, what still could be if only he were present. On a rainy Tuesday 3 weeks later, Josephine sat in the waiting room of Dr. Patel's office, anxiously checking her watch. She'd been experiencing persistent fatigue and dizziness for weeks, symptoms she'd attributed to stress and her increased workload. "Mrs. Reeves?" The nurse called, and Josephine followed her to the examination room. Dr. Patel's expression was gentle but concerned after the examination. "Your blood pressure is significantly elevated and I'm worried about these symptoms. I'd like to run some additional tests." "Is it serious?" Josephine asked. "It could be just stress, but with your family history of heart conditions, I don't want to take chances." Dr. Patel paused. "Is your husband available to come with you for the follow-up?" The question stung more than it should have. "He's overseas on business." "Perhaps another family member?" These situations are always easier with support. Josephine nodded non-committally, knowing there would be no one accompanying her. Her parents had passed years ago, and she had no siblings. Friends like Deirdre would offer, but this felt too personal, too emblematic of the fundamental loneliness of her marriage. That night, she tried calling Marcus but reached his voicemail. She left a message, deliberately casual, making no mention of the doctor's appointment. "Just checking in. Call when you can." He returned the call 2 days later while she was in a foundation meeting. "Sorry I missed you," he said when she called back. "We're in the final negotiation stages. The Chung Group is pushing back on some terms, but we're close." Josephine listened to the familiar excitement in his voice, the passion that had once drawn her to him, but now highlighted the chasm between them. "Marcus," she interrupted quietly. "Do you know what day it is?" A pause. Thursday the 17th? It's our 3-year, 4-month anniversary, she said, surprising herself with the words. They'd never celebrated monthly anniversaries, but suddenly it seemed important to mark the passage of time, the slow erosion of what they'd built. Joe, he began, his voice softening. I know it's been difficult. I had a doctor's appointment, she continued, the words tumbling out. They're concerned about my heart. I have more tests next week. The silence that followed stretched painfully. I'll fly back, he finally said. I can hand things off to the team for a few days. No, she replied, the single word carrying the weight of months of disappointment. Don't disrupt your work. I'm handling it. After they hung up, Josephine sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back seemed both familiar and foreign, stronger than she'd been a year ago, but hollowed out in ways that had nothing to do with her physical health. She opened her jewelry box and touched the emerald necklace from their anniversary, still unworn. Beside it lay her grandmother's simple silver locket, a family heirloom containing a photograph of her grandparents on their wedding day, still smiling at each other after 60 years of marriage. That night, she began drafting a letter to Marcus, words she wasn't sure she'd ever send but needed to write. Whatever the medical tests revealed, she understood with sudden clarity that she couldn't continue living in the shadow of promises unfulfilled. Either their marriage would become a true partnership, or she would need to find the courage to walk away from the distant shores of a life half-lived. The unraveling. The Chung Group's headquarters in Singapore gleamed like a crystal fortress against the night skyline. On the 38th floor, Marcus Reeves loosened his tie as he stared at the latest projections. 3 months of negotiations, and the acquisition was unraveling before his eyes. They're backing out, explained Wen Ling, his local legal counsel. The board received a competing offer from Nakamura Tech this morning. Higher valuation, fewer restructuring requirements. That's impossible, Marcus muttered, scrolling through the documents. We had exclusivity in the agreement. A gentleman's agreement only, Wen replied carefully. Nothing binding was signed. The realization hit Marcus with unexpected force. He'd miscalculated, overconfident in his charm and Horizon's reputation. For the first time in years, he faced a significant professional failure. Worse, he'd spent nearly 3 months away from home for nothing. His thoughts turned to Josephine and their brief conversation about her health. He'd meant to call back, to ask for details, but the crisis with the Chung deal had consumed every waking moment. Now, staring at the wreckage of his plans, her words echoed with new significance. Book me on the next flight to Los Angeles, he told his assistant. Family emergency. The 17-hour journey gave Marcus unwelcome time to reflect. He scrolled through photos on his phone, business associates, industry events, landmarks, from cities worldwide. He had to swipe back almost a year to find pictures of Josephine. In the most recent one, she stood by their pool at sunset, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When had he stopped taking photos of his wife? When had he stopped seeing her? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering their early days, Josephine challenging his ideas during a climate change panel, her intelligence and passion captivating him immediately. Their whirlwind courtship had felt inevitable, 2 ambitious people recognizing in each other a perfect complement. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten the most important deal he'd ever made, the promises spoken on their wedding day. The plane landed in Los Angeles on a perfect spring morning. Marcus texted Josephine from the tarmac. Surprise, coming. Home early, can't wait to see you. No response. Exhaustion and jet lag clouded his thoughts as his driver navigated the familiar coastal route to Malibu. The failure in Singapore still stung, but for the first time it felt secondary to the anxiety building about what awaited him at home. The house appeared as immaculate as ever when he arrived. Josephine, he called, his voice echoing through the marble entrance hall. Silence answered. Marcus moved through the rooms, noticing subtle changes. New books on the shelves, different flowers in the vases, a yoga mat rolled in the corner of the sunroom. Signs of a life continuing without him. In their bedroom, he found her closet partially empty, key pieces of her wardrobe missing. Panic rose in his throat as he called her name again, louder this time. On his desk in the study, he found a sealed envelope addressed to him in Josephine's elegant handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Marcus, if you're reading this, you've finally come home. I've been rehearsing these words for weeks, trying to find the perfect way to explain what's happened to us, to me. There is no perfect way. The medical tests were inconclusive. The doctors believe my symptoms are manifestations of stress and anxiety, my body's way of telling me what my heart has known for some time. Something has to change. I've gone to stay with my Aunt Eleanor in Oregon. You've never met her because you were always too busy when I suggested visiting. She's my only remaining family, and I need family right now. I don't know if I'm leaving our marriage or just the empty shell it's become. I only know I can't keep waiting for a future that never arrives, for promises that remain just beyond reach. You once told me that everything you built was for us. Somewhere along the way, us disappeared and only the building remained. I still love you, Marcus. I'm not sure that's enough anymore. Josephine Marcus read the letter 3 times before setting it down with shaking hands. He sank into his chair, the magnitude of his failure, not in business but in love, washing over him. The Chang acquisition suddenly seemed trivial compared to the prospect of losing Josephine. He reached for his phone to call her, then stopped. What would he say? Another promise to change? Another assurance that this time would be different? He'd become a man whose word held weight in boardrooms across the world but meant nothing in his own home. That evening, Marcus walked alone on the beach below their house, watching families gather as the sun set. A father lifted his laughing daughter onto his shoulders while his wife took photos. An elderly couple strolled hand in hand at the water's edge. Ordinary moments of connection that had become foreign to his existence. His phone buzzed with messages from the Singapore team, updates about salvaging components of the failed deal. For the first time, he silenced the notifications without reading them. Instead, he pulled up his contact list and called Deirdre, Josephine's closest friend. She answered with obvious surprise. Marcus? Is everything okay? No, he admitted. Nothing is okay. Josephine is gone, and I think I've just realized how blind I've been. I need your help. The conversation that followed was painful. Deirdre held nothing back about how Josephine had struggled, how the foundation work had become her lifeline, how she'd gradually stopped mentioning Marcus's name in conversation. She's built a life without you because you gave her no choice, Deirdre concluded bluntly. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Marcus stood at the edge of the water as darkness fell, the vastness of the ocean mirroring the void he'd created in his marriage. The path forward wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, his priorities were. That night, he made 3 phone calls, to his COO, his board chairman, and his executive team. By morning, he had set in motion a restructuring that would shock the business world. Horizon Technologies would continue without its founder at the helm of daily operations. As dawn broke over the Pacific, Marcus booked a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon. He had no plan beyond finding Josephine, and, for once in his meticulously organized life, that felt exactly right. Crossroads Astoria, Oregon welcomed visitors with a perpetual mist that softened the edges of its Victorian homes and historic waterfront. Marcus's rental car wound through streets flanked by hills on one side and the vast Columbia River on the other. The GPS directed him to a neighborhood of well-maintained heritage houses, eventually stopping before a blue 2-story home with a wraparound porch. He sat in the idling car, rehearsing words that seemed inadequate no matter how he arranged them. After a decade of confident presentations to rooms full of investors, he found himself paralyzed by the prospect of facing one woman, the only one who truly mattered. The door opened before he could reach it. Eleanor Fraser stood in the entrance, silver-haired and straight-backed, studying him with eyes that matched Josephine's. She mentioned you might come, she said without preamble, though I didn't expect it so soon. Is she here? Marcus asked, his voice rough with anxiety. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing. Why should I tell you? The question caught him off guard. In his world, doors opened, information flowed, obstacles disappeared. But here, in this quiet coastal town, his name and wealth meant nothing. Because I love her, he said simply. Because I've failed her in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Something in his voice must have reached her because her expression softened slightly. She's not here. She's volunteering at the Maritime Museum today. Follow the main road toward the waterfront. You can't miss it. Marcus thanked her and turned to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. Mr. Reeves. She waited until he faced her again. My niece gave up parts of herself to fit into your world. Don't ask her to do that again unless you're willing to make room for all of who she is. The Maritime Museum occupied a converted cannery building overlooking the river. Inside, the smell of old wood and brine created an atmosphere of preserved history. Marcus wandered through exhibits of shipwrecks and fishing equipment, searching for Josephine among the scattered visitors. He found her in a small reading room, leading a group of elementary school children through an interactive presentation about marine conservation. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. So different from the polished image she maintained in Los Angeles, yet somehow more vibrantly herself. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching as she answered eager questions with patient enthusiasm. One little girl asked about saving the whales, and Josephine knelt to her level, explaining complex environmental challenges in terms a child could understand. It was the same passion that had first drawn him to her at that climate change panel, years ago, a passion he'd encouraged and then gradually ignored. When the children filed out for their next activity, Josephine remained behind, organizing materials. She looked up and froze when she saw him. Marcus. His name sounded like a question and a statement at once. Joe. He stepped forward, then stopped, suddenly uncertain of his right to approach. Your aunt told me where to find you. Eleanor was supposed to call me first. Josephine's voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her nervousness, shuffling papers without purpose. I think she wanted to see me squirm, he said, attempting a smile. She's protective. Josephine set down her papers and faced him fully. Why, are you here, Marcus? The practiced speech he'd prepared on the flight disintegrated. Instead, he spoke from the raw, unfiltered truth. Because I read your letter and realized I might lose the only thing that really matters. Because I've been chasing success so long I forgot what it was for. Josephine's expression remained guarded. I've heard promises before. Not like this. Marcus took a deep breath. I've stepped down as CEO of Horizon. Her eyes widened. What? I'll remain on the board, but Naomi is taking over operations. The transition was announced yesterday. Your company is your life, she said, disbelief evident in her voice. No. You were supposed to be my life. The company was just supposed to be how we funded the dreams we shared. He moved closer, careful to maintain some distance. I failed, Joe, not just as a husband, but as the man I promised to be when we met. A museum docent appeared in the doorway, then quickly retreated upon seeing the intensity of their conversation. We can't talk here, Josephine said, gathering her things. I finish at 4. There's a coffee shop down the street. The Misty Harbor. Marcus nodded, relief washing over him at the small reprieve. I'll be there. The hours until 4 o'clock stretched endlessly. Marcus walked along the waterfront, watching fishing boats and cargo ships navigate the mighty Columbia. The pace here was so different from his usual frenetic existence. People nodded as they passed, stopping to chat about the weather or an approaching vessel. At the Misty Harbor, he secured a quiet corner table with views of the river. Josephine arrived precisely at 4:30, composed but with shadows of fatigue beneath her eyes. You look tired, he said as she sat down. Medical tests and emotional upheaval will do that, she replied, a hint of her old sharpness returning. The waitress brought coffee and departed, leaving them in a silence heavy with unspoken words. Tell me about the foundation work, Marcus finally said. Deirdre mentioned it's become important to you. Something like surprise flickered across Josephine's face before she began describing the West Side Women's Foundation, her voice gradually warming as she explained their mission and her new role. Marcus listened intently, asking questions that revealed genuine interest. "You never mentioned the job offer," he said when she finished. "Would you have noticed if I had?" The question contained no bitterness, only sad curiosity. Marcus couldn't. Probably not. I was too wrapped up in my own world. That's been our problem, hasn't it? Your world, my world, but no shared world anymore. Josephine stirred her coffee, watching the swirls. "What happened in Singapore, Marcus?" "Something must have changed." He described the collapsed deal, but then continued to the epiphany that followed. "I realized I'd spent 3 months chasing something that ultimately didn't matter, while the one thing that did was slipping away at home. Business failures happen," she said carefully. "They don't usually lead to someone giving up their company." It wasn't giving up. It was choosing. Marcus reached across the table but stopped short of touching her hand. "I have a proposal for you, Josephine. Not a promise. Those I've broken too often. A concrete plan." Her eyebrow raised skeptically. "I'm listening." "First, I'm staying in Astoria for as long as it takes to rebuild what we've lost, whether that's weeks or months. I've rented a cottage near the water." He paused. "Second, I'm establishing a foundation focused on sustainable technology for developing communities, using my expertise but aligned with your values. I'd like your input on its structure." Josephine's expression remained neutral. "And third? If you decide to come home, it doesn't have to be to Los Angeles. We can live wherever you want. Oregon if you love it here. Europe. A small island. I don't care, as long as we're building a life together instead of parallel existences." She studied him, searching for insincerity. "What about Horizon? Quarterly board meetings, some remote consulting, nothing that takes priority over us." He met her gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm just asking for a chance to show you this isn't another empty promise." The sun was setting over the river, painting the water with streaks of gold and crimson. Outside the window, a family walked past, laughing together. "I've missed you," Josephine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the busy entrepreneur. You. The man who once stayed up all night debating environmental policy with me. The man who saw me as a partner, not an accessory to success." "He's still here," Marcus replied softly. "A little battered, a lot humbled, but still here." For the first time since his arrival, Josephine smiled. A small, cautious expression, but genuine. "Eleanor has invited you for dinner tomorrow night. She wants to interrogate you properly." It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a beginning. As they walked out of the coffee shop together, maintaining a careful distance, the evening air carried the scent of possibility, of a crossroads chosen not in haste, but with deliberate care. "I'll be there," Marcus said, watching as Josephine climbed into her car. "For dinner, for whatever comes next, for as long as it takes." She nodded once before driving away, leaving him standing on the misty street corner, more hopeful than he'd felt in years. Rekindled path 1 year later, sunlight streamed through tall windows of a renovated boathouse overlooking Puget Sound. The space had been transformed into a combination home office and studio, where Josephine sat reviewing environmental impact assessments, while Marcus conducted a video conference in the adjacent room. Their voices occasionally drifted between spaces, separate work but interconnected lives. "The Kenyan implementation is exceeding expectations," Marcus was saying. "Solar capacity is 30% above projections, and the community training program has already graduated its first class of local technicians." After finishing her own call, Josephine moved to the kitchen to prepare tea. Through the window, she watched a pair of eagles soar over the water. They'd discovered this property 6 months ago, a historic home on Washington's Olympic Peninsula, that offered both seclusion and proximity to Seattle's resources. The perfect compromise. The journey to this peaceful coexistence had been neither straight nor easy. Those first weeks in Astoria had been filled with difficult conversations, painful revelations, and tentative steps toward rebuilding trust. Eleanor had indeed interrogated Marcus over dinner, her questions pointed but fair, forcing both of them to articulate what they truly wanted from their marriage. "You've been living as business associates with occasional romantic moments," Eleanor had observed bluntly. "That's not a partnership. That's a merger agreement." Her words had sparked a pivotal conversation that night as they walked along the misty shore. Josephine had finally expressed the full depth of her loneliness and resentment. Marcus had acknowledged his addiction to achievement and the hollow validation it provided. They talked until dawn, not solving everything but bringing long-buried truths into the light. The kettle whistled, pulling Josephine back to the present. She prepared 2 cups just as Marcus ended his call and joined her in the kitchen. "Good. News from Nairobi?" she asked, handing him his tea. "Better than we anticipated." He took a sip, still occasionally looking surprised when she remembered exactly how he liked it. 1 spoon of honey, no milk. "The Horizon Technologies Foundation is making a real difference there." "You mean the Reeves Foundation," she corrected with a smile. They'd changed the name 6 months ago to reflect its independence from the company Marcus had once led. He shrugged, returning her smile. "Old habits. How's the Willamette River proposal coming?" "The Preservation Trust is reviewing our recommendations. It looks promising." Josephine touched her slightly rounded belly, a gesture that had become automatic in the past few weeks. "Though I may need to adjust my site visits next month." Marcus's eyes softened as they always did when reminded of their coming child. At 43, parenthood had seemed an increasingly distant possibility for them, making this pregnancy all the more precious. Dr. Rivera said moderate activity is fine, he reminded her, though his protective instincts were obvious. "Hiking through wetlands at 7 months pregnant isn't exactly moderate," she laughed. "Deirdre has offered to handle the fieldwork. She arrives tomorrow for the strategy session." They moved to the deck overlooking the water, settling into the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over months of intention and effort. The foundation work had given them a shared purpose, Marcus providing technical expertise and business acumen, while Josephine directed their environmental and social impact initiatives. "I had a call from Wen Ling yesterday," Marcus mentioned casually. "The Chung Group is interested in partnership opportunities with the Foundation's renewable energy projects in Southeast Asia." Josephine raised an eyebrow. "The same Chung Group that derailed the Singapore acquisition?" "The very same." A hint of his old competitive spark flashed in his eyes. "Apparently, Nakamura's promises fell through. Their stock is down 30% this quarter." "And how does that make you feel?" Josephine asked, genuinely curious. Once such news would have triggered his drive to capitalize on a competitor's weakness to engineer a corporate takeover. Marcus considered the question seriously. Vindicated briefly, then oddly detached. He reached for her hand. "I still enjoy the strategy, the problem-solving, but the obsessive need to win at all costs? That's gone." She interlaced her fingers with his, remembering the man who once canceled their anniversary trip because a rival had announced a new product line. The transformation wasn't miraculous. He still worked intensely, still occasionally lost track of time when engaged in a project, but the fundamental shift in priorities remained steady. "The Seattle Times wants to interview us next week," Josephine mentioned, "about the Foundation's first-year results and the community development approach." "Both of us?" Marcus asked. That was their specific request. "The power couple redefining technological philanthropy" was the phrase they used. He laughed. "A year ago, those interviews were always about stock prices and market disruption. A year ago, we were barely speaking." Josephine's tone held no accusation, just acknowledgement of how far they'd come. As evening approached, they walked along the private beach below their home, a ritual they'd established regardless of weather or workload. Physical connection had returned more easily than emotional intimacy, but gradually the walls between them had dissolved through deliberate vulnerability and sustained presence. I had that dream again last night, Josephine confessed, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues. The one where I'm alone in the Malibu house calling for you through empty rooms. Marcus tightened his arm around her shoulders. I'm right here. I know. She leaned into his embrace. The dream ends differently now. You always appear and take my hand. We walk out together. They stood in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared over the sound. Later that night, lying in bed with his hand resting protectively over their growing child, Josephine reflected on the unexpected path that had led them here. The loneliness that had once defined her marriage had been replaced by a deeper connection than she'd imagined possible. Not perfect, they still disagreed, still occasionally retreated into old patterns when stressed, but authentic and evolving. What are you thinking about? Marcus murmured, half asleep. How sometimes things need to break before they can be rebuilt stronger. He nodded against her shoulder. I was so afraid of failure that I nearly failed at the only thing that mattered. The following afternoon, their home filled with activity as foundation team members arrived for the quarterly strategy session. Deirdre hugged Josephine tightly, then stepped back to assess her pregnancy. Motherhood suits you, she declared. Though I still can't believe you're running a major foundation while growing a human. We're running it, Josephine corrected, gesturing toward Marcus, who was deep in conversation with their international projects director. Deirdre followed her gaze. He's really changed, hasn't he? We both have. As the meeting commenced in their converted boathouse office, Josephine presented their environmental education initiatives, while Marcus outlined technological implementation strategies. They moved in tandem, complementing each other's approaches, occasionally finishing each other's sentences, partners in the truest sense. Later, as team members mingled during a break, Victoria Hernandez from the Westside Women's Foundation, now a board member of their new organization, approached Josephine. Remember when you first volunteered with us? She asked. You were looking for purpose outside your marriage. Josephine nodded. It saved me in many ways. And now? Victoria glanced toward Marcus, who was showing their finance director satellite images of potential project sites in Indonesia. Now we're building purpose together. Josephine smiled as Marcus looked up, catching her eye across the room. It turns out that's what we both needed all along. That evening, after everyone had departed, they sat on their deck watching a family of otters play in the twilight waters. Marcus held out a small, wrapped package. What's this? Josephine asked, surprised. Open it. Inside was a simple silver compass, elegantly crafted but not ostentatious like the jewelry he once gave her. Engraved on the back were the words, "Every journey leads home when we travel together." It's beautiful, she said, genuinely touched. I wanted something to mark this year. He placed his hand over hers. Not with emeralds or diamonds, but with something that symbolizes what we've found. Josephine leaned against him. The compass, warm in her palm. Direction, she said softly, and purpose, he added. As night fell over the sound, lights from distant homes twinkled like earthbound stars across the water. Within their home, two people who had once lost their way continued, writing a new chapter. Not a fairy tale of perfect resolution, but a human story of intentional love, hard-won wisdom, and the profound understanding that true success could only be measured in moments of genuine connection. The millionaire had indeed returned with an unbelievable proposal, not for grand gestures or lavish promises, but for the radical simplicity of two lives fully intertwined. And in accepting, Josephine had not relinquished her independence but expanded it to include a partnership stronger than either could have built alone.